The Zodiac Killer mystery remains one of the strangest and most enigmatic crime stories ever told, even to this day. This is a fictitious imagining of what may very well have happened between Richard, a very compelling suspect, and the very beautiful and outgoing Darlene. This is not to be taken as fact, it is fiction, although there are some elements of truth. And here is our story. Richard first noticed Darlene at the Vallejo House of Pancakes on a dreary Tuesday morning in February. The windows were fogged with condensation from the rain outside and the steam rising from hot plates of pancakes inside. She moved with a casual grace between tables, auburn hair catching the dim light, laugh lines crinkling at the corners of her eyes when she smiled at the regulars. Richard wasn't a regular yet, but he would be soon. He watched her over the rim of his coffee cup, the way her fingers delicately handled the syrup dispenser, the slight sway of her hips as she navigated between tables, the musical quality of her voice when she called orders back to the kitchen. Something about her lodged in his mind like a splinter, impossible to remove, gradually inflaming everything around it. Richard returned the next day, requesting Darlene's section, and the next day, and the day after that. He learned her schedule, adjusted his own to match. He left generous tips, studied what made her laugh, memorized the small details she shared about her life during brief exchanges. The wedding ring on her finger meant nothing to Richard. Obstacles could be overcome, barriers could be broken. Richard was patient. Richard was determined. Richard was falling into an abyss of obsession that would consume not only him but everyone in its widening path. By late spring, Richard knew where Darlene lived, which car she drove, that her marriage to Jim was struggling, that she liked amaretto in her coffee on Friday afternoons, that she hummed when she thought no one was listening. He constructed elaborate fantasies about their future together. In his mind, they were inevitable. In his apartment, a journal filled with observations about Darlene grew thicker by the day. Innocent at first glance, notes about her favorite music based on what she hummed, color preferences based on her clothing choices, observations about her mood on different days. But beneath the surface lurked something more sinister, a catalogue of possessiveness mistaken for devotion. When Richard overheard Darlene telling another waitress about moving to Albany, New York with Jim for a fresh start, something crystallized in his mind. The thought of losing her daily presence was intolerable. The distance would be unendurable. The next morning, Richard gave notice at his job. Within 2 weeks, he had liquidated his modest savings, sold or stored his possessions, and bought a one-way ticket to Albany. The country stretched beneath the airplane wings as Richard stared out the window, mentally rehearsing the coincidental meeting he would stage with Darlene in her new city. Albany proved more difficult than Vallejo for surveillance. The winter was harsh, the neighborhoods more closed off. Richard rented a small apartment 6 blocks from the house Darlene and Jim had purchased. He found work at a warehouse, arranged his shifts to maximize potential Darlene sightings. Persistence paid off eventually. Richard, accidentally, encountered Darlene at a grocery store 3 weeks after arriving. Her surprise seemed genuine, her smile reflexive but strained around the edges when he explained his own job transfer to Albany. Richard savored every second of conversation, mentally replaying it for days afterward. He began frequenting the same coffee shop where she stopped each morning, the laundromat where she washed clothes on Thursdays when their machine broke down, the park where she sometimes read alone on benches. Each sighting fed the growing malignancy of his obsession. Each interaction reinforced his delusion that destiny was drawing them together, that she must feel the invisible current between them. When Darlene and Jim moved back to Vallejo 8 months later, Richard felt vindicated. Their return confirmed what he already knew: they belonged in Vallejo. He belonged wherever she was. The cross-country return journey felt like a pilgrimage. Richard established himself quickly back in the familiar surroundings of Vallejo, taking a small apartment with a direct sightline to the route Darlene drove to work. He resumed his patronage of the House of Pancakes, though Darlene now worked fewer shifts there and more at a cocktail lounge downtown. Richard adapted accordingly. The lounge offered new opportunities for observation, new routines to memorize, new staff members whose trust he could cultivate for information about Darlene. He became a fixture at the corner of the bar 3 nights a week, nursing the same whiskey sour for hours, gaze tracking Darlene's movements through the smoky dimness. Her marriage to Jim was visibly disintegrating. Richard noted with clinical precision the nights Jim failed to pick her up, the arguments visible through car windows in the parking lot, the increasing frequency with which Darlene accepted rides home from male co-workers. The invitation to the painting party came after months of careful groundwork. Richard had cultivated a persona of harmless friendliness among Darlene's co-workers. He had positioned himself as a reliable, unobtrusive presence in her peripheral awareness. When Maggie from the lounge mentioned the gathering at Darlene's house, bringing people together to help paint her living room, "Isn't that clever?" Richard volunteered immediately. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Richard purchased expensive brushes, researched painting techniques, selected clothing that would appear casual but flattering. The night of the party arrived with the weight of destiny. Richard brought wine, premium paint rollers, and the quiet intensity that had become his trademark. Darlene's house hummed with activity and music. Richard positioned himself strategically, always within sightline of Darlene but rarely approaching directly. He absorbed the details of her home like a sponge, photographs, book titles, the scent of her perfume lingering in hallways. He watched her laugh with other guests, touch arms casually, whisper private jokes in ears that weren't his. With each such observation, something wound tighter in Richard's chest. The wine glass in his hand developed a hairline crack from the pressure of his grip. No one noticed the thin line of blood trickling between his fingers, dripping onto his carefully selected shirt. No one observed the dangerous stillness that had overtaken him, the predatory focus of his gaze tracking Darlene's every movement. The weeks following the painting party marked a dark evolution in Richard's obsession. He began following Darlene more openly, less concerned about discretion than before. He observed her meeting different men around Vallejo, at cafes, outside movie theaters, in parking lots of bars. He catalogued each perceived betrayal with meticulous detail. The shrine in his apartment expanded, photographs taken from increasingly close range, items retrieved from her trash, a lipstick-marked napkin stolen from the lounge, strands of hair collected from her brush in the employee bathroom. Richard's journal entries grew more erratic, the handwriting increasingly distorted, pages sometimes torn with the force of his pen strokes. One night, after witnessing Darlene kissing a man outside a downtown bar, Richard returned to his apartment in a state beyond rage. The emotion consuming him had no name in ordinary human experience. He hurled dishes against walls with methodical deliberation. He overturned his bookshelf, sending volumes crashing to the floor. He screamed profanities into the empty air, his voice rising to a pitch that frightened even himself. The culmination came when he slammed his bedroom door with such violence that the wood split vertically, the frame splintered, and cracks radiated across his ceiling like lightning. Plaster dust rained down, coating Richard's sweat-drenched hair and wild eyes, transforming him into something ghostly and terrifying. July 4, 1969 dawned hot and oppressive in Vallejo. Independence Day festivities provided convenient cover for Richard's increasingly erratic behavior. Neighbors attributed his odd comings and goings, the muttering they sometimes heard through walls, to holiday excitement or intoxication. Richard spent the day cleaning his apartment with obsessive precision, organizing his shrine to Darlene, and loading and unloading his handgun repeatedly. As darkness fell and fireworks began to punctuate the night sky with bursts of color, Richard drove aimlessly through Vallejo's streets. His circuitous route eventually brought him past Blue Rock Springs Park shortly before midnight. The parking area was largely deserted as most revelers had gathered downtown for the main fireworks display. A familiar car caught Richard's attention immediately, Darlene's white Chevrolet Corvair. Through the windshield, Richard could make out two figures inside. Darlene's profile was unmistakable, illuminated by the dashboard lights. Beside her sat a man Richard recognized from his surveillance, Mike, her new boyfriend. Despite her ongoing marriage to Jim, Darlene had been seeing Mike with increasing frequency. Richard had photographed them together 14 times in the past month. The sight of them now, alone in the intimate confines of the car, sent a surge of something molten through Richard's veins. Richard drove past initially, circling the surrounding blocks while his mind raced ahead of his conscious thoughts. The decision formed in the darker recesses of his psyche, bubbling up as if from some external source. 20 minutes later, Richard returned to Blue Rock Springs Park, parking his car directly behind Darlene's. He killed his headlights, sat motionless for 93 seconds. He would later recall counting each one, then reached for his loaded handgun and a flashlight. The weight of the weapon felt significant in his palm, like an extension of his arm rather than a foreign object. Richard approached the Corvair with measured steps, directing his flashlight beam at the ground until he reached the passenger side where Mike sat. Motion inside indicated they had noticed his approach. Mike rolled down his window, squinting against the sudden intrusion of the flashlight beam. Richard now pointed directly at his face. Recognition flickered across Darlene's features as she leaned forward to peer past Mike at the nighttime visitor. "That's just my sweetie pie, Richard," she said to Mike, her voice carrying a dismissive familiarity that detonated something final inside Richard's mind. His response emerged with unnatural calmness, belying the chaos behind his eyes. "I don't feel very sweet tonight." The first gunshot shattered more than the night air and the car window. It ruptured reality itself, transforming Richard irrevocably. The second, third, and fourth shots came in rapid succession, methodical despite the frenzy behind them. Blood sprayed across the interior of the Corvair, across Mike's convulsing body, across Darlene's terrified face frozen in a scream that died in her throat as bullets tore through her chest and neck. Richard turned away from the carnage, took 4 steps toward his car, then hesitated as he heard gurgling moans from inside the vehicle. Mike was still alive. The revelation triggered fresh rage in Richard. He returned to the passenger side, extended his arm through the shattered window, and fired 5 more rounds at point-blank range into Mike's body until the sounds ceased completely. Silence descended, broken only by the distant pop of celebratory fireworks and the ringing in Richard's ears. He drove home with all windows down despite the summer heat, allowing the night air to wash over him, cleansing him of gunpowder residue and baptizing him into his new identity. He felt hollow and full simultaneously, emptied of his former self yet inhabited by something greater and more terrible. At 22 minutes past midnight, now technically July 5th, Richard dialed the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone 12 blocks from his apartment. The dispatcher who answered identified herself as Nancy. Richard's voice remained steady, almost conversational. "I want to report a murder," he stated without preamble. "No, a double murder. I killed those kids in the park tonight." Nancy asked questions. Where, when, how many victims? Richard provided precise details about the location, the number of shots fired, the positions of the bodies. "They were sitting in a car," he explained with detached accuracy. "I used a 9mm Luger." He terminated the call abruptly when Nancy attempted to keep him on the line, her voice revealing the growing tension of recognition that this was not a prank call. Richard knew that Darlene was dead. He believed Mike had died as well, though this assumption would prove incorrect, a fact that would later fuel Richard's growing mythology and feed his compulsion to communicate with authorities and the public. On July 31, 1969, Richard mailed 3 carefully prepared letters to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each envelope contained identical content: a confession to the Blue Rock Springs attack, details that only the killer could know, and a cryptogram he had spent weeks perfecting. Each letter was signed with a symbol Richard had designed specifically for this purpose, a circle bisected by a cross, reminiscent of crosshairs. "This is the Zodiac speaking," he wrote, introducing the persona that would become infamous throughout California and beyond. The name had come to him during his research into astrology, which Darlene had once mentioned interest in during a conversation at the House of Pancakes. The symbol, the cryptogram, the name, all carefully calculated to inspire fear, command respect, and elevate what had begun as a crime of obsessive rage into something more mythic and ungraspable. These first letters marked the beginning of a years-long campaign of terror, communication, and evasion. The infatuation that had begun with a waitress at a pancake house would transform into one of history's most notorious killing sprees. The police would never identify or capture Richard. The Zodiac Killer would officially claim 5 victims, though in correspondence Richard would boast of 37 souls taken. Investigators would dedicate decades to the case, following countless leads that dissolved into dead ends. The letters continued sporadically, each more taunting than the last, each revealing a killer growing increasingly comfortable with his infamous status, increasingly confident in his ability to evade capture. And it all began with a man watching a woman pour coffee. It all began with desire corroding into possession, with obsession masquerading as love. It all began with Richard seeing Darlene across a crowded diner one rainy February morning, his mind whispering, "You are mine forever."